Well, it seems we know what direction the vaccine mandates are going to be headed in next. It was obvious since last Thursday when Joe Biden came out and unveiled the nature of what this mandate was, how it was limited to employees who work at businesses with more than 100 employees. A totally arbitrary category of American. And so it was clear that the reason why they limited it in that sense was only because they didn't think they could get away with a blanket mandate of just saying, hey, every single person in the country has to get it. And so that was the very ham-fisted way that they had of sort of tailoring it so that it wasn't like, hey, we're telling 350 million people, go get your shot right now or else we're going to throw you in prison. It was easier for the administration to say to 80 to 100 million people, go get the shot or you're going to lose your job, essentially. Yes, there's that testing exemption, but a lot of businesses are not going to want to pay for an employee to go get tested once a week. So Fauci has been on TV a couple of times now, I believe, and he's been asked, hey, just out of the blue, this wasn't a planted question or anything, is it possible that we might start asking people for proof of vaccination to fly on an airplane? Isn't it crazy that people can travel between, American states from Boston to LA or from Atlanta to Dallas on an airplane, and they don't have to show proof of vaccination? Isn't that nuts, Tony? And he said, you know what? Yes, that's crazy to think about. How is it that we've gone this long and people without vaccines are still flying on airplanes? That seems crazy to me. But you know what? We're not there yet, but it's certainly something we're thinking about. Oh, we're not just thinking about it. We're really thinking about it. And so what Fauci's talking about here is, in effect, moving towards a hardening of state borders. I don't think that they could mandate this for intrastate travel, just because of the nature of the Commerce Clause. But then again, planes don't really fly within states a whole lot anyway. If you're talking about getting on an airplane, you're pretty much going to be talking about international or interstate travel. And so this is an attempt to limit unvaccinated people's freedom of movement, which is, hear me out on this, it's kind of a good start. It's actually something that I could get on board with, not because I agree with it in principle, but because what the end result would be is a hardening of state boundaries here in the U.S., which would help to dissolve the current political and economic union in which we have been intertwined since 1789. Any longtime followers of this channel knows that I think that the ultimate solution to our political problems is what's been called a national divorce of some sort, but broadly speaking, just a form of decentralization. And that does not necessarily, while I think that in the end we will end up with more freedom, that does not necessarily mean that in the interim we're going to be more free. What I see here with this interstate travel ban for the unvaccinated, what I see is a progression towards a decentralization of our society. You aren't really a nation if you can't travel from one part of the nation to another. And I don't think that this will stop at just airplanes. There is already a bill in Congress that a Democrat has brought up to ban people from riding on planes and Amtrak trains, which, Amtrak for most of the country, that's not really a consideration, but it is something. I mean, there are some people who ride Amtrak trains around. And like the mandate for employers who have more than 100 employees, I think that this should be seen as a first step. It's not just going to end at planes and trains. Eventually, I think that it could be expanded to actual roadways. The federal government has a lot of pull when it comes to regulating public roads. Anyone who was alive in the 70s, long before I was born, remembers the old phrase, arrive alive, drive 55. Well, a lot of states didn't want to lower the speed limit on their highways to 55 miles per hour, because a lot of states, the wide open spaces, that's really slow to drive. And the federal government imposed the 55 mile an hour speed limit on these states by blackmailing them, essentially, by withholding federal funds that would have, been sent back to the states ordinarily. And so I think there's certainly been a lot of crazier things done already than the federal government trying to use their leverage over the highway system to try and mandate people to get vaccinated. I think that you could see at some point in the future, once we have this, this interstate travel ban for airplanes and trains for the unvaccinated, I do think that it is possible that you get vaccine checks at state borders on public roads. And at that point, once we've reached that stage, you no longer have a nation. We will, I think, be irrevocably walking down the path of complete dissolution. Because the point of this is it's purely a punitive measure. We know that this is a non-sterilizing vaccine and that it is not stopping the spread of the virus. They're not mandating vaccines for public health reasons. They are mandating vaccines as sort of a culture war tactic. And so the way that they look at it is interstate travel and international travel is a privilege granted to you by the regime. And if you don't do as the regime says, and you don't get in their good graces by accepting your Fauci ouchie, you're going to be denied what they see as that privilege. And you crazy right-wingers, because only a right-wing person would have any problem with getting this shot, you're going to be stuck in your podunk little red state, unable to go anywhere else. Oh, your mom's sick and dying in a hospital in Florida? Sorry, you can't drive from Michigan down to Florida to visit your dying mother unless you get the shot. And so the states are going to get cut off from each other. And unless people come into compliance, those sanctions will not be relieved. What we're looking at, I think, in the near future are the U.S. government imposing sanctions not on a foreign nation like Iran or Russia or North Korea like we're used to them doing. They will be imposing them on U.S. states themselves. And of course, politically, just like when you have these other countries like Russia and Iran, the political incentive for the leaders is not to be bullied by the sanctions into doing what the U.S. federal government wants. It's to do the opposite, because that's usually what the voters in those polities want. And so, I talked about, right when Biden first came into office, the potential of a travel ban to Florida, something that it was a trial balloon that they were floating. And it didn't go over well, so they didn't end up going with it. But that's the nature of a trial balloon. They're just throwing it out there and saying, hey, what would everybody think of if we did this? And then when people come out and say, oh, that's a terrible idea, then the White House comes out and says, hey, that was fake news. We never said that. That's why they have Fauci out there right now talking about this airplane travel ban. They're going much further with this than they were talking about the blanket Florida travel ban. But which tells me that there's almost a certainty that we will see within the next couple of months this ban on airplane travel for the unvaccinated. But that in of itself, like I say, is such an extreme step that going the extra mile a little bit, extending, of course, the imposition of the vaccine mandate, from companies with 100 employees to all companies, that's going to be a small step. Extending the travel ban from people just flying on airplanes and trains to also people driving on highways, just setting up simple checkpoints on the interstate, on I-95, I-75, and I-10 here in Florida, and I guess probably setting up similar roadblocks at any other small roads that cross the border. Not at all as a sign, an affront to freedom, but just for your safety, just to check, just your friendly neighborhood Department of Transportation worker, standing there, with a clipboard and a hazmat suit, checking for your Fauci ouchie identification card, or your RFID chip, or your QR code. And once we get to that point, I think that there probably will be no turning back. I don't know how you unbake that cake, how you unbreak that glass. Because really, that's what you're doing. It's like shattering a plate glass window. You're permanently breaking the bonds that bind the 50 states together. I think that we could see, even under this. I don't want to speculate too much now. Now I'm getting into hey, once this happens, what are other things? I'm kind of looking down the dominoes a little too far. I don't want to get too much on a domino theory here. We saw how domino theory worked out for Americans during the Cold War. They look pretty stupid in hindsight, but if we look at this this group of states that are openly rebelling against the vaccine mandates and trying to sue over it, the current vaccine mandate, the very limited one that Biden issued last Thursday, we could see in a situation in which there is a serious interstate travel ban that these states work out bilateral agreements with each other, or maybe not even bilateral agreements, maybe one grand agreement to allow travel between those several states against the federal rules. That's something that's also a potential beyond just the 50 states becoming more and more isolated from each other as a result of the imposition of these various federal rules. It is possible that we see, a confederation of unvaccinated states. And who knows what sorts of other restrictions the feds will be able to think up to impose on unvaccinated people, because again, it's all about just making their lives difficult. It's about turning them into second-class citizens. And this is why I wish, or I hope, that there will be a renaissance for nullification and interposition, because in the short term, that's our only defense. We need our local and state authorities to nullify federal law and interpose themselves in between their voters and the federal government. Certain leaders, like the sheriff of Riverside, California, has vowed to do that, but we need a lot more. And these measures, I think, are going to keep getting more and more intense, because it's sort of, it's cliche to call it insanity, but that's exactly what it is. Every time that their restrictions fail to curb the spread of this virus, the instinct of the lockdowner crowd is to just double down. And as you continue to double down and double down and double down and double down, the restrictions become more and more onerous. You approach that asymptotic Stalinist Australia system, and at a certain point, your society will begin to completely break down. We here in the United States, we do not have a society that is nearly unified enough to withstand the terror that the people of Australia are being put through. And so as, I won't say the left, I guess as the Democratic and perhaps metropolitan is a better way of putting it, as the metropolitans, or the cosmopolitans, as they continue down this road and they impose more and more restrictions on people, trying to punish individual Americans for the spread of this virus, inevitably things will stay about the same or get worse. This virus is not going away. It's not going to be eradicated through vaccination. That is a fantasy. We know that to be true now. That was a hope. It was something I hoped. I hoped, of course. I mean, why wouldn't you hope that the vaccines work really well and, could truly sterilize people and wipe out the spread of this virus? But, with over half of the U.S. population, over 70% of adults, I think, at this point vaccinated, it doesn't seem to have made a huge difference empirically. Hopefully I put in enough caveats there for YouTube. And so they can never admit that the vaccine is not nearly as effective as they advertised as being. They can't admit that maybe it's not quite so perfect. So they will have to blame other people, and they will have to impose more and more restrictions in order to correct for the lack of eradication of the virus. They have to keep, chasing this dream of COVID-0. And so I don't think this is something that will just disappear by the next election or the election after that. I think this is going to continue. And the lockdown crowd is therefore going to continue to try and impose more and more pain onto their class enemies, which will push this country to a breaking point. Perhaps I was wrong in saying that I thought that America's collapse was going to be, inevitably tied to a financial crisis. And, and no matter how bad things got socially, that was just setting the stage for things to collapse, as a result of the financial crisis. But frankly, if our political system continues to cannibalize itself in this manner, we may very well get to a point to where the financial collapse is not the cause of the collapse of the political system, but rather it's inverted to where the collapse of the political system creates a financial crisis. Because as time goes on here, it seems like, the Dems are just getting worse and worse. And their voters are plenty happy to go along with it. They support this. This is what, a good chunk of this country wants. But there's a whole another big chunk that couldn't want anything less. And so the more they try and impose this vision of totalitarianism onto the rest of the country, the less inclined that other half of the country is going to be towards sharing a political union with them. So that, I guess, would be the silver lining behind these mandates. They're bad in the short term. They're bad for the individual people who are affected by them. But in the aggregate, in the long term, if they continue to intensify, and they're as ham-fisted about it, as they have been so far. One of the things I said last week was that I thought that Biden made a huge mistake, which is good for me, good for us, by doing this out in the open. He should have coordinated a vaccine mandate behind the scenes with corporate, America, and said, "Oh no, this is all private sector. This is nothing to do with me." He should have tried to sneak it in, be a little more coy about it. But instead, he wants to take credit for these mandates, and so he slapped his name on it, which has made this, an even more polarizing issue than it otherwise would have been, which again is a good thing as far as I'm concerned, because it's going to happen either way. So, with that said, I will see you folks back here tomorrow.